powoli почнемо.
We're going to start. People joining in will find themselves in the middle, in medias res, in the midst of a lecture. Good evening, everyone, and welcome at the Center for Urban History. We have with us a lecture that will be a switch from our online format to an in-person format. Last year we did a series of online discussions at the center entitled Source as Choice, and this lecture is a continuation of that series in this year and in person, offline, but there will be a recording as well. So I very much hope that we will have the opportunity to, those who won't be able to join us will be able to watch later. Source as Choice. This was a challenge. Many initiatives were started last year that documented and continue to document the war in Ukraine. And this experience brings us back to basic questions of knowledge creation. What is a source? What sort of choices, what sort of decisions are made in particular situations? Where does something become a source? Where is that source located? Where is it found or not found? Where is it perceptible or visible? And when we talk about the situations of extreme violence, and we're talking about a war, we understand that these choices and those who make those choices can also be an act of deepening violence, but also an act of resistance. And today we are being joined from Warsaw by Dr. Piotr Rypson. Dr. Piotr Rypson is curator of the Jewish Institute in Warsaw, but before that he implemented numerous curator and research projects, including at the National Museum at Warsaw, where there were several large exhibitions, including the Constant Gallery for the 20th century art, as well as an exhibition that brought forth numerous discussions dedicated to the centenary of the Polish state. And at the Jewish Historical Institute, Piotr has prepared an exhibition on the Warsaw Ghetto, and he's now working with an exhibition that has to do with the Ringelblum archive. And that is what we asked Piotr to prepare a lecture for us on. Additionally, I would like to announce that we'll have another meeting as part of the Osolineum meetings, because Piotr is president of the International Association of Museums of ICOMOS Poland, and he has worked a lot in this regard with museums in Ukraine, museums in other countries, within the context of the full-scale war, and on matters of museums and matters of heritage. But that will be tomorrow, in at a different premises. We'll tell you more later. Piotr, the floor is yours. The lecture will be in English, so we will have an interpreter working, and feel free to make use of it. The floor is yours.
I feel like the president of a country here with these two microphones. But, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm extremely happy to be in Lviv in these very difficult times. I've been here many times before the war, and so now it's a real privilege to be here and to talk about something which is not an extremely happy story, but since the theme of this series of lectures here was concentrating on sources and historical sources and different ways of dealing with the sources. So we found it proper to introduce a topic that I'm working on now, which is the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. So today I'm going to talk both about what this archive was, its origins, its functions, its roles, its structure, and the contents, but also about what we do with the archive. In 2 weeks, precisely 2 weeks and 2 days, I will be opening an exhibition of the archive in Germany, an exhibition presenting the archive of the ghetto in Munich. So I will talk also about how we are using these amazing sources to present the archive, its creators, and also to explain what it means actually, what this archive can be for us today. The archive is known by the name of the Ringelblum archive, and Emanuel Ringelblum, this is just a short thing from the Wikipedia. It's a long story, so I just scanned it from the wiki. He was a historian, a Jewish historian, who was also a Marxist, I think, and he was most instrumental in creating a group of intellectuals in the Warsaw Ghetto that started to work on the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto as a form of an opposition and against the German occupiers. He was an experienced man when war started in 1939. He was working with the IVO before that in Vilnius, which was the Jewish kind of historical institute of sorts. But also I think his mindset changed when Jews were thrown out from Germany in 1938, Jews with Polish citizenship. And Poland didn't want to accept them. The Polish right-wing government, military government at that time, didn't want those Jews in. So they were caught in a kind of a border situation between Germany and Poland, living under the sky, men, women, children, etc. And that was the first time I think the Jewish community in Warsaw organized itself and started to provide help to this group of people, which eventually, being Polish citizens, they were let into the country, but it took a long time for them to get there. So Ringelblum also was experienced in something that involves a quick organization, self-help, and relying on resources which are collected from the community rather than from any authorities, etc., etc. Now, as you know, or as you may know, in 1939, when the war broke out and Warsaw fell quite quickly actually to the Germans, Germans started to prepare quite quickly a special district in Warsaw to create the Jewish district, the ghetto. They didn't want to use the word ghetto, they called it the Jewish district. They wanted to separate the Jews from the Poles and of course from the Germans. So actually Warsaw consisted, by 1940, when the ghetto was circled with a wall, of 3 cities in one city. One city was Jewish, and this is the area marked here on the map. One city was Polish and one city was German. So we had a very unusual situation of a sort of a concentration camp, but located in the middle of a city, where up to 500,000 people were residing. And they were all basically sentenced to death, which they didn't know at that time when the ghetto was sealed. So if you know Warsaw a little bit, the place here at the bottom, maybe I'll try to point it, no, I want it pointed. The place here at the bottom is where the Palace of Culture stands. And way up north to the top, we have something which is already close to Warsaw Ghetto, which is the northern train station. So it's a huge part of Warsaw, extending from the old town to the cemeteries. And there Jews from first from Warsaw, then from the areas around Warsaw, and then also from other countries, especially from Germany, were herded. When I'll be speaking briefly about the history, I'll be showing materials only from the Ringelblum archive. The Ringelblum archive, which consisted of documents, diaries, photographs, and whatnot. And one of the things that the archivists wanted to have was to document all gates, I think, to the ghetto. So we have a series of photographs that are showing the walls of the ghetto and the gates that were leading. There was a number of gates that were leading in and out of the Jewish district. Jews were not allowed to leave that district without a special permit. Now, Ringelblum, when he saw that the Jewish community is closed within that closed district walls, he thought, oh, this is a great moment actually to write a story of the Jewish population as it is, of the ordinary folk, of all the classes, brought together in one place, to write a story of the Jews under German occupation, documenting it with a very precise methodology that is used by historians. And in order to do so, he also, one thing which is important, I think he said, like, most of the historians, Jewish historians that are concentrating on the history of the Jewish people, are focusing on rabbis, kings, and biblical stories. Here we have the people, we have all trades and all attitudes and all political views in one place. Let's try to describe that community. And in order to do so, he created a group which called itself Oneg Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat means the joy of the Sabbath, because they were meeting on Saturdays around the table, and they were discussing work that was done during the week, and also setting up, commissioning new tasks that were to be done in near future. We don't know exactly how the structure of the group looked like, because basically all of them were killed apart from 2 people. Everybody died. We don't even know how many members of Oneg Shabbat were. But what is interesting is also that the members themselves, they didn't know, because it was a circle within a circle within a circle. So Ringelblum knew everybody, and his closest associates, probably Hersch Asser and maybe one person more. But then, for security reasons, the other people didn't know about each other. He also didn't want journalists to be in the group, because he said that journalists talk too much, they are too talkative. He wanted both academic professionals like historians, but also simple lay people who, for example, work as a postman in the ghetto, because the postman who walks around apartments and places and can describe how people live, what do their apartments look like, how they change in time, etc., etc. So it was a big plan to describe the Jewish community in all its complexities. We have a list of some of the members that is coming from the notes from the Ringelblum archive. This is one of the objects we'll be showing in Germany. Now, to give you an idea about the structure of the archive, because it's very important to understand that it's not a bottle with a letter inside which is thrown into water so people can find it someday and see, what the writer was thinking about. They mapped with time. They were also changing the themes a little bit, but you had small ghettos throughout Poland, but also outside of Poland, including Lviv and Vilnius. Then you had a documentation about territories under Soviet occupation in the first phase of the war. You had particular locations such as Kalisz or Wartengau, which was Western Poland, that became part of the German Reich. You had a separate set on mass murders, when mass murders started to take place at the turn of 1941 and 42. You had a collection of underground press which was coming from the ghetto. You had documentation of particular political parties which were functioning inside of the ghettos. But apart from personal diaries, which the members of Oneg Shabbat were all told to keep, so everybody would keep a personal diary describing in most objective way what is happening around them. They also, for example, asked children to write short essays, or they were collecting school essays from children to describe first days of the war, or what the war means for them, and so on and so on and so on. There were also drawings and a lot of other things, including official documents of the so-called Judenrat, which is the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto. So there were both sources that were gathered, but also sources that were produced by the members. So, you know, he had a very, very clear idea that probably sensing the scale of danger, you know, life in the ghetto in 1940 was not very easy. In 1941, people were dying by 1,000 a week, so because of hunger. So it was clear that the whole situation is going to get into a critical phase, but they still didn't know about the Holocaust. The Holocaust did not begin as the action, which started in 1942, in the beginning of 1942. So here, how to put it, their way of working was changing with the dynamics of time. In the beginning, they were documenting life. In the second phase, they were documenting death. And the whole idea, which began, I think, to take form at the end of 1941, was the big question: who will write our history? Will it be the Germans? Will it be the people that killed the whole community? Or will it be us? And here appears the, I think, critical element of what we are talking about, which is that, you know, the source. What is the source here? Because for years or decades, this archive, which is the biggest archive of the Holocaust in the world, there's nothing bigger than this. It consists, I think, around 30,000 pages of documents. But for many years, historians did not consider this as a valid, important source. They relied on official documents, on statistical data, on numbers, procedures, and also the whole procedure of the Holocaust was much more interesting than the narrative of the victims. The victims were thought to be biased, emotional, and eventually not as credible as a source than what is coming from the official documents. And Ringelblum thought precisely otherwise. You know, he thought our voice has to be clearly heard, but in order to do so, we have to be as objective as possible. Which of course did not happen all the way, because a lot of the personal diaries are full of emotions and are bringing tears to eyes when you read them. They are really extremely moving documents. And so I'm going to show now a series of different types of sources that Ringelblum and his team were collecting. So here you have different types of announcements of the Jewish Council, which are mainly talking about the rations of food, or that you can get 60 grams of salt, for example, in a period of time, or you can get a certain amount of potatoes for a certain price, and so forth. But also you have some amazing type of announcements. For example, it is forbidden to use the bath, and to use the bath will be considered a sabotage, which meant basically a death sentence. So you know, you have an amazing range of official documents. This one is handwritten, but it's an official document. And as we've seen, photographs that are showing everyday life in the ghetto. I'm not showing the drastic photographs because in the archive we also have the documentation of the hunger sickness of children in the ghetto. and these are very powerful images. But you can see here, for example, that they were documenting also smugglers. This was, death sentence type of activity, because in order to feed the Jews in the ghetto, they had to smuggle. The smuggling was the biggest trade in the northern district. So you can see that the smugglers are here feeling safe. One of them is looking directly into the camera, so into the lens, so they know that it's a Jewish photographer that is making the photographs for a particular reason. This is also important, because this type of sources, we have very few sources of the kind, where it's the oppressed who are making the photographs, not the Germans. What is most known, repeated and over-repeated in all sorts of publications and presentations, lectures, etc., is usually photographs done by German soldiers who are going into the ghetto, like, cowboys going to the Wild West photographing Indians. That was like exotic and interesting, and people dying on the street, and starved children, and so forth and so forth. So we try to avoid this type of contextless use of such material, and in this case we are relying on the material from the Ringelblum archive only. So apart from these small scenes showing different aspects of everyday poor Jewish life, there is also some little narratives here and there, and we'll get to that. But also, I think Ringelblum or the Oneg Shabbat commissioned from people who could draw well little narratives about life in the ghetto. And this is one of these little narratives. It's about a guy who was a caretaker. He was collecting corpses from the street and taking them to the cemetery for the poor, so they would be thrown into a big hole in the earth and just buried there as a group. And one day he had to take his wife, and his child is helping him to take the mother away to the Jewish cemetery. So this drawing and a short note accompanying the drawing, which explains what is shown here, was done by an architect who actually, I think he finished the architecture school in Lviv, if I'm not mistaken. His name was Benjamin Rosenfeld, and he left, I think, around 7 or 8 such drawings, which have an element of dark humor and satire in them. I mean, satire is not the word, it's rather dark humor, because he's showing drastic scenes, but in a almost like a cartoon way, with a very short commentary. So the paradoxes of the life in the ghetto are drawn by this artist. A lot of underground press, surprisingly a lot. I mean, there was a lot of underground publications. Jews were known, of course, for their skills in education, reading, publishing, writing, etc., etc. So all the political parties, of which there was a number, had their publications done, and Germans did not care much for that. They didn't interfere. Of course, it was a clandestine activity, but this was not something that would be visible, I think, to the German occupiers. The more that they were not that physically present in the ghetto itself. Their great trick and the mastery consisted of sealing the people inside, keeping them guarded with different measures, and letting themselves to be ruled by the Jewish Council, which was ordered directly by the Germans. So they were not directly interfering in most cases, apart from occasional murder sweeps to the ghetto to create the feeling of anxiety and fear before the Shoah, before the Holocaust. And so on and so on. We have lots of different documents. There were also, ration cards, ID cards, but also handwritten poem about the Jewish child, das jüdisches Kind, here on the right, and pieces of literature, theater plays, collections of poetry, and a number of artworks which were done in the ghetto, like the one on the right, which you see here on the right. It's an album which was created by Teofila Rajchranicka, a woman 21 years old at the time, who created a satirical album about the Jewish Council and its different functions within the ghetto. Here you have the caretaker, who has a sort of a mobile rickshaw to carry a corpse, and he's dressed officially in a black uniform, and a child, innocent child with a gun is looking at him. It's drawn in the style of 1930 cartoons. And on the left you see a drawing by Gela Sekstein, who was an artist. She was a wife of one of the leaders of Oneg Shabbat, and at the last moment, when they were hiding the archive, she hit around 200, I think, drawings, aquarels, and so forth into a can, and so we have that collection today. And little stories. A story, for example, which was photographed very precisely, where the head of the Judenrat, he is shown here bottom right in a hat in the center, was able to release in March 1942 a group of people that were sentenced to death for smuggling. Children and women, and you see them, each of them in this central line got a loaf of bread, so they immediately start to eat this bread because they were starving of hunger. It's an ironic story because this is March 1942. In June 1942, all these people were carried off to Treblinka, to the death camp. So that little victory of Adam Chernyakov, who was the head of the Judenrat, was very, very short-lived. And we have a little mini visual narrative about what happened then, with a crowd of people onlooking gathered in the ghetto to look at this unusual event there, because this was something that was totally unusual. And also little things, such as candy wrappers from a small factory of candy in the ghetto, or other sorts of material. But then comes the moment where the group, the Oneg Shabbat group, realizes that the death machine was spun into motion. And they decide to change totally their approach to documenting as precisely as possible the Holocaust. So they were making, a lot of these documents are lists of people, lists of locations, numbers, figures. They tried to note down each name that they could identify of people that were killed on the street or killed, in another location. As is the tradition in the Jewish culture, and basically in any culture, to try to remember the name of the deceased, the particular attention was put to note down these names. And also, they were gathering this information to create reports that would be sent outside of the ghetto, not only to the Polish underground, but also to the authorities in the exile, to London and to America. And there were two of such big reports created, and they actually reached London, which the Ringelblum group thought is a really great accomplishment. Because one of the basic feelings there was loneliness, that nobody knows about what is happening here. So they were creating also this type of reports from all the sources gathered, and including statistics, very sad, dry statistics about how many people died, which week, in what family, was the family consisted of, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, what is the death rate in the given month or given week, and so forth and so forth. And then comes the moment where they really understand that this is the end, which is around June 1942. They start to see the announcements of the German authorities, And also they get reports from Treblinka, which was a death camp organized by the Germans in, say, 1.5 hour southeast from Warsaw in the forests, which was a very precisely organized death machine. So it was not a concentration camp where you keep people, but it was a camp where you take people, you kill them immediately, and then you process their bodies through different means, you know, usually burning the bodies and trying to mill the bones and so forth and so forth. A real, you know, kind of German technology style machine of death. But some people escaped from Treblinka, which was quite amazing, and they came back to the Warsaw Ghetto. So here in the Ringelblum archive we have 2 accounts from Treblinka with the very precise plan drawn how the death camp is organized, how people are processed to death, and a written testimony by one of the Jews who was chosen to be one of the persons who is sorting clothes or then throwing the dead bodies into the big pyres when the bodies are burned. Before they had the crematoriums made, you know, they were creating a kind of a Teutonic style piles of bodies and burning them there. Strange enough, although they were sealed off in this place, they were getting a lot of information not only from the death camps, not only from the ghetto itself, but also from other territories. Why was that? It was that because people who escaped, Jews who escaped from the concentration camp, or they escaped from the death camp, or they escaped from the transport, they would rather often go back to the ghetto, where they felt often safer than on the so-called Aryan side or the Polish side, because there was a lot of danger waiting for them there, denunciations, people, you know, extorting money, or just taking them directly to the Germans for a price. So there was a lot of like feedback from that death camps, and as I said, names. How many were killed in Buchach? How many were killed on the corner of the street on that day? What were their names? And this is again an attempt to note down as precisely as possible every incident that happened, so that death is not anonymous. So the death machine, which is designed basically to create total anonymity, to destroy the trace of these people, is not functioning the way that it was designed. So lists of names are a very important element of what we have here, and there is a number of documents that testify that with dates, and you can see here the date 22 June. This was the date when Germans came into the ghetto, assisted with other formations, different groups of guards, and they started to transport people by thousands to a location in the northern part of the ghetto, near the train tracks. From there they were taken onto the trains and went that day or 1 day later or 3 days later to Treblinka, where they would be killed. So from June 1942 till early autumn, most of the inhabitants of the ghetto were murdered. One can understand that the whole process of Action Reinhardt that was taking place in other locations was in a way a preparation for the final action in Warsaw, where the biggest group was held. You know, to kill 300,000 people in a short period of time, it takes you know, very good planning and very good logistics. So Germans had to prepare for that very well, and the Jews were, you know, that group were very conscious of that. So they were also precisely documenting that whole process, and you see the last position here on this list is Treblinka. And a number of poems that were created at that time. This one is titled Już czas, this is the time. So this was really the end of the big ghetto in Warsaw. There was also an aftermath. And aftermath consisted of a period between what they called the Great Action in the ghetto and spring 1943, where a number of German entrepreneurs had their slave businesses in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were really fighting against the Gestapo and the SS to keep these operations going as long as possible, because they were profiting from it. They were getting labor for free. And although Himmler actually ordered the destruction of all those people, a number up to 50,000 still were, I think, around 50,000 were still either hiding or working in the ghetto. And we have a number of documents still in the Ringelblum archive from that last period. Because what happened was that before the ghetto stood up in an uprising, the first part of the archive was hidden. It was buried in one of the cellars in a school in somewhere on this picture. You can see probably in the top left on this whiter part of town. I will explain why it's whiter in a second. And it was buried in 10 metal boxes by Israel Lichtenstein. He was a teacher who was working in a school, so he was helped by two of his associates, two young men, and hid the archive, the first part of the archive there. Just a short word of explanation. Why is it so white here? Because this is a photograph made in 1944, where the ghetto was razed basically to the ground as a desert. So this is something that happened after the Warsaw uprising, the ghetto uprising, which is also a Warsaw uprising in spring 1943, and Germans who had some losses of soldiers in the beginning decided rather to detonate and burn building by building than to go into the ghetto and fight. And after that, when the ghetto was burned, together with the people who were there partly, they took the bricks out of the ghetto to transport them to Germany, because the German machine of the war was extremely efficient also economically. Not only bodies were decomposed to take out the teeth, the golden teeth, etc., but also the city was decomposed in order to take out the bricks, the remaining furnitures, etc., all the clothes and so forth. And this is more or less the story. The second part of the ghetto of the archive was hidden sometime in spring 1943, and it was hidden in two big milk cans. And we also have that. They were both discovered in 1949 or 50. I will come back to that in a second. Now, we have that amazing set of documents, which was, of course, conserved, preserved. A lot of the documents were badly damaged by water and by time. The first batch of the archive was discovered in 1947, and so a couple of years after rain and weather did their job on these metal boxes, which were not that ideal for preserving the archive, but it started to get published as a full set basically recently in the 2000s. And so it did not function really as a source for historians, but also for one particular reason. The materials in the ghetto were written in Yiddish and in Polish, and a little bit in German and Hebrew. So in order to work with this source material, you really had to command these languages to be able. And German was not a big issue. Most historians know this language, but Yiddish and Polish, of course, were not languages that were accessible to most of the scholars in the West. And now the archive started to play its role really years and decades after It was created, hidden, discovered, preserved, and worked upon. Now all of the documents are published in 36 volumes into Polish, and subsequently they are being published into the English. And now I was asked 3 years ago to create an exhibition that would present the archive abroad in Munich, in Germany. I was extremely glad to have this opportunity, and very, very privileged to have this opportunity. The more that the location where the archive will be shown in 2 weeks is the location where formerly the first big seat of the NSDAP had its place in Munich. What you see now is a new building. It is called the NS Docu Center, which is the documentation center for National Socialism. I would say structurally it's a little bit similar probably to the center here, you know, because it's both a research group, an exhibition, and of course dealing with very complex narratives about this National Socialism and all the things that came out of it, all the echoes of the National Socialists in the city where National Socialism was created. So to have the opportunity of bringing the voices from the Warsaw Ghetto to the seat of the Nazi power was an amazing opportunity, but also a big challenge. This is the former seat of NSDAP, exactly where this nice white building is located today, and this is where it is located. It's located in the center of the Nazi district in Munich. I'm showing it with the arrow. This is the yellow arrow is showing the seat of the NSDAP, the former seat of the NSDAP, which is called the Brown House, Brunner House. And the two buildings on the sides, this is the Chancellery and the Chancellery of the NSDAP on the right, where they kept all the files and documents of the, I don't remember, 15 million members of the Nazi Party. And on the left, you have the representative offices of Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, and all the, you know, the top brass of the NSDAP. And the central line is the line where the Nazis were marching with all their torches, which we know from films and from documentaries. So the location is quite amazing. The Brenner House is shown here on another picture, and this was the main kind of a glorious square of the Nazi Party and the Nazi troops for their big propaganda spectacles and performances. Yeah, again, another take on that. So here we are today in the center, and I had to make a selection of the sources to also try to show, you know, what the archive was. We know the story of the ghetto. It has been shown many times in documentaries, films, books, albums, etc. But the exhibition is not about the Warsaw Ghetto. The exhibition is about the archive, which created a big challenge for the selection of the sources and so forth. This is how it looks like today, in the everyday situation of the functioning of the NS Docu Center. Around 100,000 visitors a year, basically everybody, school children, tourists, Germans, inhabitants of Munich, and so forth and so forth. So I decided to create some clarity in the narrative and divide the story into 4 parts. One, out of necessity, we have to introduce what war is and what war was and how Oneg Shabbat was created in the context of the beginning of the Nazi terror in Warsaw. A big portion of the visitors in Munich are Persians, Afghanis, people from other continents. They have no clue about where Warsaw is, what Warsaw Ghetto was, and where the war started. It's a totally, you know, abstract thing for them. So this has to be there. Then it was very important to show the 2 important structural differences in the material. One was documenting Jewish life under German occupation, Second was documenting Shoah as the act of elimination of that community from the earth. The third part is, of course, the fourth part is, of course, a kind of an aftermath about hiding the archive, discovering the archive, and what happens later. And so we have a part which is discussing the creating of the community of the Oneg Shabbat, which is, I think, an important information that you have a communal group work as an act of opposition, which is not a military opposition. They didn't have guns or pistols, and probably most of them wouldn't know how to use them. They were just lay people. But they could create a structure of opposition and resistance that was very active and served its purpose. Then a part about the documenting of the Jewish life, which would be mapping the territory, so to speak, of the archive and the subject matter of how the work was assigned, and then the archive of suffering, so to speak, which resulted from the work. And then, as I've said before, documenting the Shoah and preserving the memory. And it was very important, while creating the exhibition, to show to the audience that we are dealing with an intellectual structure, that it's not a series of haphazardly gathered documents, but it's a map of themes and topics which those people tried to cover in order to create a full picture of what was happening. So this is an element that me and my German co-curator colleague tried to keep. And what came out is an exhibition that consists of three parts. Well, first part is a part where we show the people. So it was very important, since the whole narrative about the Holocaust is embedded in a context of anonymity. You know, we are dealing with millions of people, and 300,000 were killed here, 100,000 were killed there, and these people died of hunger, but we don't know who they were. We don't know their names. Out of the around 450, 500,000 people in the Warsaw Ghetto. The scholars are not very precise because it's impossible to be precise about these numbers, but it was over 450,000. We know probably around 50,000 names only. So the annihilation machine was effective to the extent that only 10% was recognized as individuals. The rest was just a mass. So it was important to show that these are individuals, real people that did real work, and we have to honor their memory and their work. And then there was a big question, okay, but how actually this archive looked like? We don't know. It was not when you think about an archive, you think about a building with registers and some shelves and some drawers, etc. But of course they didn't have anything like that. So we had to create a certain ambience, which is showing an archive, but also that it's a hidden archive. It was, that sentence for everybody that would be caught documenting, the Holocaust or documenting the German activities in the ghetto. So when you enter the room, you basically don't see much. You have to go inside to see the other view and where the vista is uncovered. And then we structure the archive with different parts and different elements, trying to give, as I said, a map of what was entered. These are computer renderings. The exhibition is being built right now, so we don't have pictures from that. And what you see here on the left bottom is special cases to show originals. One of the main curatorial decisions that I made was to show very few original works. Or works, they're not works, they're documents of very different kind. To show their uniqueness and not to overflow the visitor with lots of documents that he cannot deal with you cannot do much with anyway, because they are dry documents. But each document, which is shown, I think there are 11 of them, which is shown in those cases, is accompanied by a recording from a diary, a quotation from the Ringelblum group, or a poem or something that brings about an emotion to the experience of really learning about what is being shown there. So these cases are specially designed for each of the 11 documents that we are showing there. And after the first section, where the history of the Jewish life under occupation is being presented, you go into a second section, which is much more narrow, kind of unpleasant, which is the death corridor, I would say. This, the part where the documentation of the Holocaust is being shown. And again, we are showing a very reduced amount of information. So not to overload the viewer with numbers which and you know, extra information which creates the perception of the exhibition in the way that, you know, the viewer gets number and number and number to the experience. This corridor is closed with a photograph of the ghetto as it was destroyed. And then the third part, of which fortunately we have not only a photographic documentation but also a short film documentation, is the discovery, the miracle of the discovery of the ghetto archive by the remaining Jewish community in Warsaw. So you can see their happy faces here. They dug into the ground and found these 10 boxes. I must say that it was also a miracle that the archive was found, because there was almost nobody living from the group, only 2 people, but those 2 people didn't know where the archive was hidden. It was hidden by Israel Lichtenstein, who was killed in the spring of 1943. So they only had to guess where it could be, and they had to convince the community and the authorities of Warsaw and the new communist authorities in Warsaw that they should spend money, time and effort in a totally ruined city, ruined, you know, like Mariupol, that they have to dig into the earth to find some documents of which no one has heard about before, because it was a hidden archive, which was a great accomplishment and a great miracle. And then the second part of the archive was found later, actually by accident, where workers were working on some new living developments. What is also especially moving, and I want to also conclude this visual presentation with, was that in the last part of the archive, which was hidden in 1942 by Israel Lichtenstein. You see him drawn here by his wife on the left, and Gela Sekstein, the artist, is in the middle, and their child is on the top right. These are drawings made in 1942. They put their last wills on the top of the documents. So the last words that we find in these boxes are last words written by those people and the young students of Israel Lichtenstein who were helping him to bury the boxes, where they write about the last minutes of their life. They say, you know, these are the last hours, and please remember about us, etc., etc. Very, you know, very moving documents. So this is also an element which we are using to close the exhibition, to bring people back into the picture, and these particular individuals which were actually quite crucial for the whole story, because thanks to them the archive was hidden, was survived, and we can sort of hear almost their voices. This is one of the testaments that they left that was placed in Yiddish in the archive. And that's one of these boxes will be closing also the exhibition. This is the original, I think, tin metal boxes where the archive was hidden. And I'm trying to sum up this experience was, how to show these sources so they don't become a meaningless, boring set of documents that nobody is really interested in reading. And that it's an exhibition on not on art actually, it's an exhibition about the archive, ARG, and not an exhibition about the Warsaw Ghetto. ARG is usually, this is the acronym for the Ringelblum Archive. And also how to show that this is not an act of despair, which is done in the last moment of life, where you pack different documents, you put them in a box and you hope somebody will find them. But it's a methodological plan of work that was carried over 2 years of communal work, which shows a certain method and approach to a form of activity that is an activity of resistance and opposition to the occupation. And also how to overcome the abundance of material, because more is worse, less is better, to balance a certain minimalism of approach, but at the same time to show the extensivity, the inclusiveness of the whole source material. While at the same time, so the viewer is not totally lost, to maintain a notion of time, chronology, in the presentation of the material, and introduce the context of the ghetto, although avoiding a situation where the viewer will come out from the exhibition and he said, well, I saw an exhibition about the Warsaw Ghetto. We wanted to be the exhibition about the archive. And also, one very important aspect, to maintain the inner perspective. So the perspective of the people from inside of the ghetto. Not the people who described it from the outside, or neither the German photographers who would train their Leica cameras on the victims, who would be afraid of their gaze and would have to take off their hat on the side of the German soldier. So sticking to the material itself and keeping the inside perspective, which means also a perspective in 1940 where the Holocaust is still not visible. So to create a certain tempo of the course of events. But at the same time, engage emotions. Exhibitions of this type without emotions are dead exhibitions. Nobody will feel anything. They will come out and say, oh, I saw a lot of, kind of paper documents, and I don't even remember what was on them. Plus, a number of them are in Yiddish, a number of them are in Polish, and so for most of the audience, they are unreadable. And the main takeaways that we want the audience to take away from this experience was what I repeated a number of times, that this type of activities are a form of resistance. It's a form of a battle against the odds of history, where eventually you know that you are losing, but you want to have the final voice. And you want to overcome anonymity in that process. And to make sure that these voices are heard, especially in the context of this present exhibition, which takes place in Munich, in this very particular location. And to stress the civil form of resistance versus what is usually glorified as the armed resistance. We know about the uprisings, etc., etc. But the uprising was, a moment in the life of the ghetto. The work of the Ringelblum archive was an epopee in the history of the ghetto. And also to show that the intellectual resistance is a form of a struggle. This is a topic in itself, which is valid not only in Warsaw Ghetto or other ghettos or the Jewish community, but is valid, of course, in any society, which I think is an important element to raise, especially today, where different forms of populism and fascism are on the rage. And finally, the final note, very important, that the archive is not some sort of an anonymous body of work, but it's a creation of particular individuals who decided to devote their time, their efforts to act in this form of resistance in the realities of ultimate threat. And with this, I'd like to conclude. This is a short introduction to the team. I started the project, but then my colleague Dr. Ulla Britta Vollhardt from the German side joined in from the Munich Center Documentation Center, and Dr. Mirjam Zadov, who is the director of the Munich Center for the Documentation of National Socialism, Katarzyna Persson, who is the head of the Jewish Historical Institute, is the head of the historical section. She was our consultant, and the exhibition architecture is by a German architect, Guido Brusig. Thank you very much. And of course, I will be glad to answer any questions or comments you may have. I'm here for you.
Thank you so much, Piotr. And yeah, we'll continue in English and at some point probably. It's I'll ask your comments and questions, but first a couple of maybe comments into questions. I mean, I learned about Ringelblum archive in Warsaw in early 2000s as a part of seminar by Barbara Engelblum, a researcher, a historian and psychologist. And it kind of, I probably won't recall exactly what I thought then, but last year I thought a lot about the team as we were also doing documentation projects here, and I thought kind of memories of your study would come back, in a different way. And I think that one of the questions that I was asking, how the decisions you're making in the context of extremity is so also much, very obvious of where you come from your position, how you either continue that or challenge that optics. And you mentioned that the team excluded journalists from the, whom else they were excluding? There were actually quite a number of established historians, and Emanuel Ringelblum was actually coming with a historical degree, but not really coming from the big chair of history. He also, what he mentioned, was a social worker, an activist. So, and I think that this is like the question in how do you represent him? So, which side do you stress? Him as somebody who holds a formal title of PhD or doctor, but also somebody who is very much an activist. And that also brings to the second question, of like this, how do you, because it was, it was intellectually path-breaking work. We talk about historical, like school of historiography, and you would come in the late 70s to the history from below, to the Alltagsgeschichte, to all of the, and I think that, so my question would be also, showing that in Germany, where you do have also a certain way not only of telling the history of Holocaust and National Socialism, but also more generally, how you challenge this rather like a chronology of intellectual thinking about what is history, who's not only who tells but also how do you tell, and they were pretty pioneering and pretty resisting to not only to violence and war and annihilation, but also at this very fragile moment, existential, kind of rethinking what not only is a history of Jewish people, but history as such. I would, if you could comment, and then we'll get some questions.
Well, maybe I'll just answer a little bit to that. It's, an exhibition cannot do everything. Mm-hmm. It's a powerful tool, but it has a lot of limitations. You cannot control the viewer. The viewer can, spend 5 minutes in the room and say like, oh my God, how boring this is, you know, this is not for me, and just leave, and you won't even know what he thought or she thought. So it has to have a certain simplicity and clarity, I think, especially when you are talking to a non-professional audience, to an audience which is everybody, very often people who are not educated in these parts of history, or European history in general. And I think the Munich Documentation Center serves also in the city, and was designed in the city as a tool to educate the newcomers, so immigrants, people from other cultures, to tell, yes, in this city, Nazi doctrine was born. Yes, we are responsible for what happened, and that's why we built this nice white building. And so an exhibition that takes place in that context has to keep a certain, you know, clarity and simplicity of discourse. So to the first question of, or comment, trying to show the actual difference of Ringelblum and his group from what we expect as being professionals on the job, is something very difficult to do. Each of these persons is presented with a biography in the introduction. These biographies can be taken out, and we have a sort of more database there, where you can learn about. And you can see that Rachel Auerbach, she was an activist and a writer. It's not true that journalists were not there. There was one or two, but it was just said that, you know, Ringelblum said that they, you know, talk too much, so let's have other people. There were some writers, of course, but also some very, very simple people that could provide information. So we try to give this extra information, but it's like for the viewer who has a certain deeper interest in what is happening. And I think the rest can be done in a series of events that will, of course, accompany the exhibition. So we will have, you know, discussions, small conference, different forms of presentations. I didn't also show everything that will be in the show, because we are also showing films in the exhibition and different other elements that enrich the visitor's experience. But yeah, this is, I think it has to be divided into the range of different events that accompany the show. Your second observation, you know, in a way, it's an ideal setup, because the permanent exhibition in Munich, which takes 4 floors, and it starts with the First World War, with the first generation of people that were scarred by the First World War, and the material, the ready material for the Nazi party that came out from that historical experience. And then you go through different stages of, you know, building the party, Hitler getting to power. But it's a dry narrative shown with photographs and photos of documents and some film material, etc., which is done precisely from a German perspective. So it's a German story about Germans. And they do not avoid speaking about the atrocities and concentration camps and that, but still it's very focused on the perpetrators. So to bring the voices from the inside, it really changes, you know, the whole narrative 180 degrees, and so in a way it makes the whole thing much easier, because there we have individual voices, the voices of the persecuted versus the perpetrators, and the tension is created immediately, I think. So yeah, there was one more aspect that I thought was important to add, that the German permanent exhibition tried to be extremely just, and I have to, although it's dry, and I think the present directors of the archive are not very happy with how it is presented, because it's done in a very German professorial way, like illustrated chapters of a history book. But the last part of the exhibition, and I thought that's very brave, is dedicated to the life of members of Einsatzgruppen, of the extermination groups, etc. Their life in Munich after the war, where they became judges, rectors of universities, the criminals that made wonderful careers after the war in the city where this museum para-museum is located. So, so it's a very brave type of show, which created a lot of discomfort for the present citizens of Munich, whose fathers or grandfathers or grandmothers or whoever, you know, were engaged in the Holocaust and other crimes that the Nazis have committed. And first we were thinking about actually making certain interventions into the context of the permanent exhibition. But then we decided to do a separate show because we wanted to have the archive as a sort of as a whole and keep that choir of voices together in one space. I don't know if I answered your observation, but this is something that I can add to that.
Then also ask other questions coming. If you have some questions or comments, please. Pytania, komentarze. Bogdan.
Thank you for this very important work that you do. I know that you're an art historian and you deal with images on a more profound level than just illustrating some chapters, as you say, of history. And while you were talking, I was thinking about Didi Huberman, and he is this famous text for the exhibition where he was and others accused of kind of, you know, showing the scenes of murder as a kind of possibility for people to just to glance into the problems of others, not just to have the real empathy. You probably know about all the story about Didi Huberman and these images from Auschwitz and photographs. But what they did in this exhibition, they made some images very kind of objects of contemplation, let's say. And my question to you is, you said that you try to make like not too much of the objects. Do you see some images? Because I'm thinking, because I assume that from what you said that you have these narratives as the most emotional things, but how do you deal with emotional images? And do you make them as objects of contemplation and then to make people think about these motivations? So it's not just illustration, but then how this resistance that you mentioned is made through images, you know, whether image is as a weapon, can it actually teach us something, not just illustrate? So this is my question.
Yeah, thank you, Bogdan. You know, it's of course a very important issue that you raise, and I've read the recent text by Didi Huberman, who also commented on the photographs from the Ringelblum archive. There is a set of essays that he has written that were published in the French, and a selection of that was published in Polish. And it's not very easy for me, I think, to address this issue, because when I started to work with the material, I felt I'm walking on very, very thin ice, and it's very easy to misuse it. That's what I was thinking. It's very easy to misuse the material, because we don't even know how many photographs they were. We do not know all the intentions that the archivists had when they were collecting this photographic material. We don't know if that was a sort of a series of different accidents that they got these photographs and not the other photographs, although we can see that there was a methodological approach to document the gates and the walls. So they wanted to show us how that looked. But the rest of a number of the photographs are very, I would say, uneven. You know, there's a whole photo narrative about one event, and then there is bits and pieces of images from different parts of the ghetto, very different from what the Germans were photographing, a very different type of takes. And now, what would be the object of contemplation, and what would be the procedure for contemplation, actually? I was contemplating those images, trying to understand the story that they are telling, trying to create a sequence, because what I was showing as a story, what is a photo story, nobody has shown that up to now. They were shown as separate pictures, a set of 3 that look similar, but then the rest were described as something totally different. I brought them together with the risk that I'm probably not right, but I definitely contemplated them to a great extent to understand the angle, the way the light is shown, but in a very technical way, let's say, very technical. I tried probably to refrain from this emotional story that could be easily evoked by those photographs, by the expressions of the people, all that element that anybody can do if they look at it. I didn't want to step in between as a kind of an interpreter for those people. I did not feel neither comfortable, I think, in that position, or I didn't find a justification for myself to do that. Although I have a personal connection to the Warsaw Ghetto in the sense that my mother was there, and a part of my family was for some time in the Warsaw Ghetto. So I'm emotional about that, because very often when I look at the photos, I try to see, but maybe they are also the photographs. They all survived, so I know that how they looked like, but it adds to that whole experience. But I had I had certain reservations about, I would say, the French approach to this type of imagery, about this abundance of interpretative language that, in my eyes, is trying to talk over something which eventually I think can be only an individual experience of a person who has the will to look at them and to find something. And so I'm a little bit distant and skeptical to the approach of Didi Iberman, who writes brilliantly. It's wonderful writing. But I'm on the side of minimalism in presentation. When we did an exhibition with late Paweł Śpiewak, who I think was here maybe in Lviv also, he was the former director of the Jewish Historical Institute. He passed away recently. He invited me actually to work with the Jewish Historical Institute, and with a very particular reason. He wanted me to curate with him an exhibition on the anniversary of closing the ghetto within the walls, 1940, so it was 2020, around 80 years after closing the ghetto with the walls. And Paweł, who knew that I have a curatorial career and I've done a number of different exhibitions, thought I'm going to do a kind of some wonderful show. I'm going to show somehow liminal experiences of people in the ghetto. That was his concept. He wanted to show liminal, which means extreme experiences. We listed them together with a team of people. Fear, solitude, but at the same time never being alone, so being always in a crowd. Hunger, of course. Being separated with the bands, being the other immediately. That was the first thing that the Germans said. You people have to put a tag on that you're not us. And so on. We listed, I think, 11 categories. And my main and actually only curatorial decision was that we will show almost nothing. We will show as little as possible. So for each of these categories, we will show one or two things. Second thing was we will we will cut the viewer away from other viewers. So they will have to walk into the show with the earphones and they have to listen to what the people in the ghetto are saying. So to each of the objects there was a special recording made from the diaries of Ringelblum or Levin or Rachel Auerbach, etc. But everybody has to see the show alone, in a sense. They don't have much chance to say, oh look, and to be. And the third decision, which was less my decision, more the decision of the designer of the exhibition, was to create an uncomfortable space for perception. So you had to bend a little to see something, or there was some things were shown on a surface that looked like a place to sit. And but people didn't know if they are allowed to sit next to this amazing sacred thing for the ghetto, almost religious. So uncertainty, an unbalanced type of perception. And I think it worked brilliantly, because what it is, this extreme minimalism created a total attention to these particular bits and pieces. We couldn't tell the whole story. We couldn't represent, 500,000 people or the whole story of the house. But we could show through the sound and through the image something very particular. And this is the approach that, that I would choose, sticking to the documents and to the narratives from the inside again, I don't know if I answer your question, but I did my best.
Nie wiem, może ще є запитання, можна українською.
Yeah, I have a very simple question. So you said that this archive, Ringelblum archive, is the biggest in the world, the biggest archive from the ghetto in the world. Do you know any other examples, and why do you think that Warsaw archive became so big, and is it because it accumulated so many historians in the ghetto, or what was the reason?
Well, I think we know that there were other archives. In Białystok there was an archive. In Łódź, which is in the western Poland, there was a very big ghetto, and it was very different from other ghettos, because the leaders of the ghetto convinced the Germans that we Jews can be useful for you. And so they basically trade work for life. And that ghetto was the longest existing in the territory of Poland. And in order to function, they not only produced material for themselves, but also they produced a lot of documentation for the Germans. And it's an amazing set of documents, of which a lot survived, that are, I would say, professional presentations of the economic capacity of different departments within the ghetto that are producing carpets or clothes or shoes or God knows what, to the German client. And they have a form that is a German form, I would say. As you do today in corporate life, you create, documentation for the client in the language of the client, so he understands it, and buys your story. So it's an amazing thing, illustrated with photographs, photomontages, statistical figures, etc., much richer visually than the archive of the Ringelblum group. But because they had all these tools to create this documentation, to which the German client was very pleased to see and understand that economically it makes sense to keep these Jews alive so they can produce the shoes, the uniforms or whatever they were producing, the textiles and so forth. They had all the tools to make their own documentation. So there was also clandestine, I would say a doubled archive, which was the Jewish archive for themselves. And a lot of that was kept, but it's not as big as the Ringelblum archive. I think probably also because of the size. Warsaw Ghetto was the biggest. And with 500,000 people you can really generate a lot of content. And we are not even sure today. There was all the time a story about the third part of the archive which is not found yet. We are not sure whether this third part existed at all, but we are also not sure whether the archivists were able to hide everything that they had, because obviously they didn't keep the stuff in one place. We know that in the place where I work each Monday, which is the Jewish Historical Institute, Ringelblum actually worked there as well, and they kept some of the things there among the official documents that they were allowed to keep, because classical thing, you know, you keep the things in the light so nobody will look for them. But how it was treated, how much was preserved, etc., we don't know. We know that a lot of Jews were keeping diaries, because this was one of the things that you always do when you are human in danger. This is something that, you know, keeps your focus and creates a certain perimeter of life. Something that happened, something that will happen. It's also a way of reconstructing yourself in a situation where you are constantly being, you know, falling apart. But coming back to your question, we know that there were other archives. Many of them were not preserved, and I think by the size of Warsaw, this is the main reason why this archive is the biggest, because it was just the biggest ghetto that was there, and the Jews were living there from 1940 to 1943. Reduced numbers, but it's a long span of time. If I answered your question,
Thank you for this presentation, and all the best for the upcoming exhibition. I actually have a kind of a follow-up of the question, basically follow-up from previous questions in general, because you also mentioned that you wanted to present this exhibition, the archive of the exhibition, as something that is also like work of developing a certain historiographic concept and methods of documenting the extreme situation, being a human in a situation of danger. And also Sophia mentioned about this pioneering work also for the field of history, that documenting like the very extreme situation by like preserving the voices from the inside. So I was just curious about your take on how would you situate in general this work of documenting the extreme situation in like in general historiography. How would you situate this this work, like documenting the war, documenting extremes, documenting being in the situation of danger? Is it well, of course it's not unique, but of course the experience is unique, but at the same time there are other initiatives documenting like some extreme situations, and we just there are also other archives about the Holocaust. But in general, if you think about being a situation of war, and here I'm thinking also, of course, I not want to make a comparison about the current situation, but at the same time there are initiatives documenting the current war also in a very extreme situation. So probably there are other things, other initiatives, are there projects trying to document these very extreme experiences from the situation of the inside. So how would you situate the Ringelblum archive in this, let's say, landscape of these kind of initiatives?
Well, thank you. That's of course, you know, a complex and difficult question, probably that could lead us in different directions to answer. Because on the one hand, I think it is important, and my colleagues at the Jewish Historical Institute, such as Paweł Śpiewak, for example, who is a sociologist but also a good historian, would on the one hand stress the uniqueness of the Jewish experience because of the Holocaust. But on the other hand, he would also always introduce other types of experience of extreme situations, of which we have more than necessary in the history and in the world today. In that perspective, the Jewish experience is not unique. The uniqueness of that situation, I think, consisted only from the fact that there was a plan to annihilate the whole community, right? And the community did not have any others outside of their community in a way to help. Most of our nations, ethnic groups, whatever, you know, we are in the situations of war or oppression. We have some of ours outside that they intervene, with whom we can communicate, with whom we can make sure that what happens to us as humans is known to the rest. And I think the main difference of the Ringelblum archive and the historiographical concept was that they were basically conscious at a certain point that their voice is the last voice, that there will be no Jewish community anymore of the type that existed. You know, some individuals survived, but the community did not. And the Jewish life was, as it was in 1939, it was gone forever. And it's not going to be reconstructed. So I think that creates an important difference, and this is something that, of course, in the exhibition we are not able to actually communicate in any clear way. I think it's a complex process that one has to digest, to understand that. So I don't know if I can, I know that there are different types of archival work, for example, today being done in Ukraine, for example in Kiev with the Museum of the Maidan, where war is being documented as it takes place, as it happens. In a similar way, I mean, collecting evidence, collecting narratives of people, collecting, recording voices, which of course the Jews could not record in the ghetto. But I think the clue of the difference would be that it was very difficult for the makers of the Ringelblum archive to design any future, any consequences of their work. They were writing different lines of hopes what will happen with the material, and they were kind of repeating like in a mantra or a prayer, saying, we hope that this material will serve in the future for, for something that they would usually identify as memory. I think that eventually this archive, the existence of these voices, was also helpful in the creation of the State of Israel. This is my personal opinion on that. Because the makers of the archive that survived, they went to Israel. They took parts of the archive with them, and it became one of the cornerstones, I think, for the type of post-Holocaust identity that was created. So it also served that purpose, although it's very difficult, of course, to prove it in any form. But with the other type of archives, which are created by living people in a situation of extreme dangers, with a living community around them, which is a free community, I think it's very different, and it has in itself embedded a number of dynamics which can be positive but also could be negative. To give you an example, the Jewish uprising in Warsaw in 1943, which was a small group of people in despair, fighting against the Germans, knowing that they will not win anything, that they will just die a different type of death, standing, as the songs go, die standing. There is a narrative saying, well, they were defending the civilians, perhaps. I think they were fighting, because they had no other option. And it was immediately instrumentalized by different political parties, Jewish parties, first, to show who was fighting, who was the real fighter. Was it the left or was it the right? Was it the Zionists or was it the communists? Then eventually others joined in, the Poles, the Polish communists, international communists, the Soviet communists, etc., to show that this is basically a fight against fascism, of whoever, Jews but not Jews, we are all fighting against fascism. So it was instrumentalized immediately. So if that was possible to happen, one can imagine any form of instrumentalization of such set of documents in a real-time situation as the war taking place here or anywhere else. I think this is one of the tricky aspects of this type of work, because you can rearrange the type of documents. You can use it for different purposes, and there is different political agendas which is always embedded within that. So I think what I want to say is that one should be extremely careful with this type of material, because it's in a way it's a ticking bomb which can explode in different places in different ways. That's what I can offer as an answer or a comment.
Pytania? Może tak teraz będziemy?
Well, we've been at it for an hour and a half, so maybe we can wrap up.
And I think that to conclude, it is Taras brought the topic of contemporary documentation, and you said that that there is the period of initiative of the Maidan Museum in Kyiv, and we just last week had a big symposium and conference where over 100 initiatives that came for the call doing documentation, ranging really very diversely from individuals to institutions and I think that this is, without drawing this, neither parallels nor comparisons, I think that this is also, this is the question of decentralized archive. Actually, can archive be also a decentered and decentralized, and how that possible decentralization can be a way of how it is harder to instrumentalize, and while we keep using, because we still, this is the point also of having archive and critically using it and using it again in many ways, but also how to not turn it into something that can oppress or silence. And I think in many ways, when you were speaking, there's also word hope, because while it's true that they were not seeing the future, but there was this hope and also relinquishing of the way somebody else would work. And it's kind of, there's also something that you document. I think this is an ultimate act of trust in a way, that you collect materials and you document for somebody else to tell the story that you won't use, because as researchers, we tend to be also possessive of the materials that we get and use. And I think that this is an extraordinary story of how it is a hope, but also in desperation there is a hope. So thank you so much for sharing that and sharing your research and exhibition.
Thank you.